Bataan wasn't just MGM's most brutal wartime production. It was a film about men dying in the Philippines, conceived, written, and shot while the real men it claimed to honor were being marched into Japanese captivity at bayonet point. A production that integrated its cast in defiance of its own distributor's southern markets, stole its narrative structure from a John Ford film and paid $6,500 to make the theft legal, and ended with a shot so radical for its era that every subsequent war film about defeat has lived in its shadow ever since. We are digging into the wreckage of Bataan with 20 dark facts the studio tried to bury, facts locked inside MGM production correspondence, War Department script review memos, NAACP award citations, Dor Sherry's autobiography, and a Writers Guild credit file that reveals the original ending was changed because it was too close to a film MGM did not own. Bataan arrived in production under not one, but three working titles in sequence: Back to Bataan, Bataan Patrol, and Bataan's Last Stand. Each title tells you something about what the studio was afraid of at the time it used it. Back to Bataan is optimistic. It implies return, recovery, MacArthur's promise made good. Bataan Patrol is procedural. It announces a military operation rather than a catastrophe. Bataan's Last Stand is honest. It says these men are going to die and the film will watch them do it. The studio settled on simply Bataan, a single word carrying the weight of a defeat the American public had absorbed in real time 14 months earlier, only when the writing and production were sufficiently advanced that a name change would have cost more than the name was worth. The title, Bataan, is the one that admits nothing except a location. The location does the work. Everyone watching in 1943 already knew what had happened there, but the real problem was not what the title admitted, it was what the screenplay owed to a film MGM did not own. Bataan opened in New York on June 3, 1943. The real Battle of Bataan had ended on April 9, 1942, when General Edward King surrendered approximately 76,000 American and Filipino soldiers to Japanese forces, the largest surrender in American military history. What followed was the Bataan Death March, 65 miles on foot through Philippine heat, with Japanese guards who beat, bayoneted, and shot prisoners who fell behind. Between 5,000 and 18,000 Filipino soldiers and 500 to 650 American soldiers died on the march. MGM submitted its screenplay to the War Department in October 1942, while American prisoners from the real Bataan were alive in Japanese captivity, dying in numbers the American government was not yet publicly disclosing. The film that claimed to honor the defenders of Bataan was in production, while those defenders were still enduring the consequences of the defeat the film was dramatizing. The studio's dedication to those immortal dead who heroically stayed the wave of barbaric conquest was written before most of the dead had finished dying. This is exactly why every scene of inevitable annihilation in the finished film carries a weight that no purely fictional narrative could have manufactured. The narrative structure of Bataan, a small unit of men assigned to hold a position against an overwhelming enemy force, picked off one by one until only one remains, is not an original construction. It is the plot of John Ford's The Lost Patrol, 1934, a film set in the Philippines during World War II-34. A film set in the Mesopotamian desert of World War I in which Victor McLaglen's sergeant leads a dwindling group against an invisible enemy whose faces are never shown. The structural parallels between The Lost Patrol and Bataan are not coincidental. MGM's Dor Sherry acknowledged in his autobiography that he considered Bataan a remake of the Ford film. The studio was sufficiently aware of the debt that it paid RKO Pictures $6,500 for the right to use actual footage from The Lost Patrol within Bataan itself. The payment is the clearest possible documentation of conscious appropriation. MGE did not merely adapt The Lost Patrol's narrative grammar. It embedded The Lost Patrol's actual images inside the finished film, paid for the legal right to do so, and then submitted the result to audiences as an original drama about a specific historical event. But the real problem was not the footage. It was the ending, and what happened to it between the first draft and the final cut. Robert D. Andrews' original screenplay for Bataan concluded with Sergeant Bill Dane being rescued by another patrol. Exactly what happens to Victor McLaglen's character in The Lost Patrol. The parallel was so precise that it constituted, in the judgment of the production's own creative team, an acknowledgement of the source that was commercially and artistically unacceptable. The ending was changed. In the version that reached the screen, Dane is not rescued. He digs his own grave among those of his fallen comrades, takes position behind his machine gun as the Japanese advance through the obscure ground fog, and fires directly into the camera lens as the film ends. No rescue, no survivors. The camera as the enemy. The audience looking down the barrel of the last American gun on the Bataan Peninsula. The decision to change the ending from rescue to annihilation is the single most important creative decision in the film's production, and it was driven as much by the need to distinguish Bataan from the Lost Patrol as by any artistic argument about honesty. The ending that made the film great was arrived at partly to avoid a plagiarism problem. This is exactly why the most powerful final image in American wartime cinema was produced by the need to be different from something else. Bataan was filmed entirely on MGM's Soundstage 16. The film contains no location footage from the Philippines, no tropical location work of any kind, and no exterior photography beyond the studio's immediate backlot. Given the wartime restrictions on travel and resources, MGM decided the entire production, the bridge, the jungle, the foxholes, the ravine, would be built inside a studio building in Culver City, California. Director Tay Garnett later described the set designer's construction as a real-as-hell jungle with everything except 16-foot snakes. The claim is both accurate about the quality of the craft and entirely misleading about the physical reality. A carload of tropical foliage was imported. The jungle atmosphere was maintained with the specific tricks of studio lighting and close-focus photography that prevented wide angles from revealing the stage's walls and ceiling. Contemporary reviewers noted the soundstage's presence, the smell of it, the particular quality of its artificial darkness, and found it a flaw. Contemporary letterbox viewers watching the film without the original sensory context mostly accept the jungle as a jungle. But the real problem was not the fake jungle. It was what Garnett did to his actors inside it. When Garnett became dissatisfied with how his actors were reacting in the moments before their characters died, he approached the problem as an engineering question rather than a performance question. The solution: special effects technicians tied ropes around the actors, selected to die in each sequence, and on cue, the technicians jerked the lines with sufficient force to produce the violent physical reaction the script required. The actors were not asked to act dying. They were pulled into a physical position that approximated being shot. The result, as the finished film demonstrates, is a quality of sudden, lurching physical violence in the death sequences that is remarkably unlike the carefully choreographed studio-era death and remarkably close to what sudden muscular collapse actually looks like. Garnett did not trust his actors to manufacture this with technique. He manufactured it with rope. The deaths in Bataan look different from deaths in other MGM productions of the same era because they were produced differently. The ropes are invisible in the finished film. Their effect is not. The film's climactic sequence, the last surviving member of the patrol firing his machine gun into the camera as the Japanese advanced through ground fog, required a visual effect that the soundstage could not naturally produce. Garnett's solution was to dump dry ice into tubs of water and position electric fans at low speed to blow the resulting vapor across the stage floor. The heavy white emanations that formed on the water's surface and crept across the studio floor created the ground fog through which the Japanese soldiers advance in the final minutes of the film. The practical effect is, by any measure, extraordinary, a swirling, low-lying mist that gives the sequence a genuinely nocturnal, nightmarish quality that no amount of artificial smoke could have replicated. The dry ice fog became one of the most widely discussed technical achievements in 1940s studio filmmaking. A Viewer's Mother, recalled in a contemporary IMDb review, saw the film on its original release and said it gave her more nightmares than any horror film she had ever seen. The dry ice was doing the work that the screenplay itself could not. Dory Sherry, the film's executive producer, decided that Bataan would include a black soldier among its 13-man patrol. This decision was, by the standards of Hollywood in 1943, an act of institutional courage. It was also an act of institutional deception. Sherry deliberately did not tell screenwriter Robert D. Andrews which character would be black. Sherry's reasoning, as he explained in his 1979 autobiography, Heyday, was precise. If Andrews knew he was writing a black character, he would write race-conscious dialogue. Race-conscious dialogue, speeches about prejudice, about the injustice of segregation, about what black men were fighting for, would have made the character's presence an argument rather than a fact. Sherry wanted the fact without the argument. He wanted Private Wesley Epps to exist in the patrol the way that white soldiers existed in the patrol. As a man, a soldier, a person with specific skills and a specific function without annotation. The writer wrote the character without knowing the character's race. The actor was cast. The character was black. The film presented racial integration as simply the way things were. This is exactly why Private Wesley Epps is still the most radical thing in the film, 80 years after it was made. Among the original 13 characters sketched in the screenplay's early drafts was a Native American soldier named Edward Evening Star. He was eliminated before production began. The documented reason? His characterization was weak and there were already 13 men to characterize and kill off. The elimination of Edward Evening Star from a film about the most diverse combat unit ever portrayed in American studio cinema is not a minor footnote. It is a document of how diversity was being managed as a creative resource rather than a moral commitment. A soldier cut not because his presence was wrong, but because there were, in the production's judgment, enough symbolic soldiers already. The 12 who remained represented Black, Latino, Filipino, Irish, Jewish, and Anglo-American identities. The Native American did not make the list. His absence from a film about American diversity in combat is precisely the kind of fact that the film's otherwise progressive credentials make most uncomfortable. Kenneth Spencer, who plays Private Wesley Epps, the black soldier whose integration into the patrol made the film impossible to show in parts of the American South, was a classically trained opera singer who had performed at Carnegie Hall before the war. He was not a film actor in the conventional sense. He had a bass baritone voice of operatic quality and an on-screen presence that the Hollywood Reporter described as performed with distinction. A note that sounds as an effective tribute to his race, a phrase that is itself a document of its historical moment. Spencer's Private Epps sings and hums hymns while performing demolition work. The voice that emerges from the foxhole on a Culver City soundstage is a genuine operatic instrument deployed in a war film, and it registers with a specific authority the production's entire racial integration project needed. Dignity, expressed not through speech but through music, in a film that had deliberately excluded racial dialogue. Spencer died in a car accident in 1964 at the age of 55, but the real problem was not what the studio did with Kenneth Spencer, it was what the studio's southern distributors did with the finished film. Bataan was not shown in parts of the American Deep South. The film's depiction of a racially integrated combat unit, black, white, Latino, Filipino, and Jewish soldiers fighting and dying side by side as equals, without racial hierarchy and without racial dialogue, was sufficient grounds for exhibition refusal in states whose social and legal architecture required the subordination of black citizens in every context, including wartime cinema. MGM received letters of complaint from southern markets. The studio acknowledged them and did not alter the film. What the southern refusal means, in practical terms, is that the most progressive wartime American film about racial equality was withheld from the audiences who most needed to see it, in the states where its argument had the most potential consequence. The states that banned Bataan's exhibition were not refusing a film about integration. They were refusing the proposition that a black man and a white man could die in the same foxhole for the same flag with equal dignity. The film argued that they could. Some states decided their audiences would not see the argument. In June 1943, the NAACP awarded MGM a Scroll of Merit for Bataan, congratulating the studio for showing how superfluous racial and religious problems are when common danger is faced. In February 1944, the Junior Council of the NAACP gave MGM a special award for its sympathetic portrayal of a black soldier. The awards were genuine and deserved. They were also awarded to a film depicting a racial integration that the United States military would not officially adopt until Executive Order 9981, signed by President Truman on July 26, 1948, 5 years after Bataan's release. The film showed integration as a wartime fact in 1943. The military implemented it as policy in 1948. The cinema was 5 years ahead of the government on the most basic question of American democratic equality. The NAACP awards were a recognition of that gap and an implicit indictment of the institution that kept it open. MGM submitted the Bataan screenplay to the War Department in October 1942 for what was described as consultation for the record rather than for approval or military cooperation. The War Department's Public Relations Office reviewed it and found it a good story which could make a good picture, but not a great one. The assessment noted technical inaccuracies and melodramatic elements. The studio's response was to acknowledge some melodramatic flaws and technical mistakes, a concession extracted by criticism rather than volunteered by conscience. The technical inaccuracies noted were real. The bridge depicted was not the bridge actually contested, the Japanese did not advance in the manner depicted, and the biplane parked in the jungle had no historical basis. The War Department's complaint about melodramatic flaws was an institution objecting to its own defeat being fictionalized inaccurately. It had no good argument for what the accurate version would have looked like. In May 1943, weeks before the film's theatrical premiere, MGM held a pre-screening of Bataan for a group of soldiers, press correspondents, and dignitaries who had been on the Bataan Peninsula during the siege. They approved of the picture. The Hollywood Reporter recorded their approval without irony. The approval means what it means, that some of the men who were there found the film's account of their experience credible enough to sanction. It does not mean the account was accurate, it means it was survivable, which, in the context of what those men had survived, may have been the only standard of approval that mattered. Bataan was Robert Taylor's last film before he enlisted in the United States Naval Air Corps, where he served from 1943 to 1945. Commissioned as a lieutenant, he became a flight instructor for the Naval Air Transport Division, starred in several military instructional films, and narrated the Academy Award-winning documentary, The Fighting Lady, in 1944. Taylor's enlistment was not a publicity gesture. He had completed standby for action immediately before Bataan and was at the peak of his MGM contract value when he entered service. The studio was prepared to defer his contract. Taylor insisted. The film in which he plays a man who digs his own grave and fires his machine gun at the camera until the screen goes dark was the film he made before choosing to exchange his studio salary for a military commission. The biographical weight of that sequence. The last image of Bataan's star is of a man firing into his own death, lands differently when you know that the actor behind the gun was about to put on a real uniform. The role of Leonard Perkett, the young, naive sailor whose homesickness humanizes the patrol's younger members, was originally offered to Richard Widmark. Widmark was 27, a Broadway actor who had not yet made a film. He was passed over. The role went to Robert Walker, also a newcomer, whose charming demeanor caught with audiences sufficiently that he became one of MGM's brightest young stars for the remainder of the decade. Widmark's film debut, when it arrived, was Tommy Udo in Kiss of Death, 1947, the laughing psychopath who pushes a woman in a wheelchair down a staircase. Had Widmark taken the Bataan role, the career trajectory that produced Tommy Udo might have begun differently, and the naive sailor went to Walker, the laughing killer went to Widmark. Neither man chose what he was given. Bataan gave Robert Walker his first significant screen role. He was 24. His performance as the homesick young sailor caught audiences and critics with a genuineness the film's more established cast could not quite replicate. Walker's subsequent MGM career produced Strangers on a Train, 1951, in which Hitchcock used his quality of boyish menace to devastating effect. He died on August 28, 1951, at the age of 32, during a psychiatric therapy session in which his therapist administered sodium amytal to control an agitated state. The combination of the drug and the alcohol already in his system produced a respiratory failure. Walker was not at peace in the years between Bataan and his death. His marriage to Jennifer Jones had collapsed, his mental health had deteriorated through a series of breakdowns, and his drinking was documented in studio files as a professional liability. The face that audiences first registered in Bataan's foxhole, young, earnest, frightened, brave enough to keep going, belongs to a man whose own life was being conducted in unmanaged crisis that the studio's care systems were insufficient to address. Bosley Crowther in the New York Times described Bataan as a surprisingly credible conception of what that terrible experience must have been for some of the men who endured it. With melodramatic flaws and some admitted technical mistakes, but a film that doesn't insult the honor of dead soldiers. James Agee in The Nation offered the most precise contemporary assessment. The people who made this film were lucky enough to believe in it so warmly and innocently that their cinematic intelligence and skill were released entirely to the proper business of embodiment. What they had to embody was as formal and naive as a pulp story. Both reviews identified the film's moral sincerity, and neither fully accounted for its political radicalism. Neither Crowther nor Agee named the significance of Private Wesley Epps in a nation whose military remained legally segregated. Neither addressed the explicit comparison to The Lost Patrol, whose footage was embedded in the film they were reviewing. Both engaged with the film the studio had made for wartime audiences. Neither engaged with the argument the film was making about the country those audiences were living in. The academic literature on Bataan is now more extensive than the contemporary critical literature. Brian Locke's chapter, Strange Fruit, White, Black, and Asian in the World War II combat film Bataan, published in Racial Stigma on the Hollywood Screen, positions the film as one of the most formally sophisticated racial texts in American studio wartime cinema. Lawrence Seward's Guts and Glory. The making of the American military image in film establishes it as a foundational production in the American combat film genre. TCM has programmed it repeatedly as a crown jewel of World War II studio cinema. The NAACP's awards, granted within months of the original release, anticipated by decades the academic consensus that the film's racial politics were consequential rather than incidental. The Southern Exhibition Ban, which appeared to limit the film's reach, is now understood as evidence of its power. States do not refuse to show films that are not making arguments they cannot afford to let their audiences hear. The film that survives, shot on a soundstage with ropes and dry ice and a carload of imported foliage, made while the men it claims to honor were dying in Philippine captivity, structured around a stolen narrative and an ending changed to avoid plagiarism, contains in its final 3 minutes a piece of filmmaking that has not been surpassed as an expression of what it feels like to be abandoned by the institution you served. Taylor firing the machine gun into the camera as the enemy, the audience, the future, the frame that does not flinch, the end card, so fought the heroes of Bataan. The question Bataan embeds in that final burst of fire is this: if a film made a racially integrated combat unit a fact on screen in 1943, 5 years before the military officially permitted it to be a fact in reality, while Southern states banned the film from exhibition and MGM received letters of complaint from distributors who preferred the old arrangement. Whose army was the film actually depicting, and whose army was it trying to create? Was Bataan a record of what America was, or a projection of what America owed the men it was sending to die? And if the answer is the second, what does that tell you about the gap between what a country claims to be fighting for and what it is actually prepared to permit at home? Leave that in the comments. The machine gun is still firing. If this investigation changed how you see Bataan, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films built on dangerous arguments that deserved more than the audiences they were allowed to reach, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.